Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. To start, did you all see the news that Elon Musk has confirmed that he's going to, in fact, fight Mark Zuckerberg? I know the original slate of this was they were going to have a cage fight. I don't know if it's still going to be a cage fight or just a normal fight, but apparently it's on. Elon Musk says he's getting an MRI. He might need surgery before they do it. We'll see what happens with it. But he is saying it's on. They're going to live stream it on X, the social media platform, so formerly known as Twitter, and that also they're going to donate all the proceeds to veterans groups. So here we are. Hey, we get anything fun right now. We get to watch billionaires cage fight. So that's something to look forward to. Um, that being said, let's talk about a couple stories today. I want to talk to you about, well, the White House allegedly removing 400 journalists. This ties to a change of rules the White House made. Um, One of them being not so bad, in my opinion, just basically kind of cleaning the rolls, so to speak. The other one being pretty bad, in my opinion, and I'll explain to you the nuances of this. Also, after we jump to Epoch TV, we're going to talk about the proposed, it's not technically a gag order, but they're putting a protective order on Trump, or trying to. And that's going to be significant because with Trump's latest indictment, one of the big things he's been saying is they want to put basically they want to put the 2020 election on trial. They want to show all the evidence, everything publicly. This could forbid that from taking place. So I'll go into that and explain what this means, what they're doing. But we'll have to do that on Epoch TV after we jump over, because YouTube will probably give me a strike if I talk about the anomalies in our election system. Let's put it that way. That says, let's jump into the first story. Biden White House threatens reporters with expulsion if they continue to interrupt press briefings. It says the White House is taking heat for purging more than 400 reporters from presidential press briefings following a new rule aimed at journalists. It says, according to reports, 442 reporters have lost their hard pass press pass credentials over the past 3 months. 3 months, 442 journalists purged. Now it says that results in a 31% reduction of journalists in the press briefing room. The White House told Politico that only one reporter had their application for a new hard pass denied. However, hundreds of reporters lost their passes due to the needing to meet the latest qualifications. Let me explain what this is. In my opinion, there's a bit of nuance here that's being exaggerated. I'll explain what that is, but there's actually some concerning stuff, in my opinion, as well. So let me explain to you how I see this. It says, under the new guidelines, reporters can still access the White House, though their permissions must be reviewed daily. They could also be subjected to increased inspection from the Secret Service. I have a problem with this. Personally, I'd say that the issue is it basically gives pressure on the journalists to make sure they're playing nicely. Now, you could argue, well, they're not going to, for example, be tossing people out just because they write something unfavorable against, Biden or something like that. They're not going to be tossing people out based on that. Some of the other rules relate to this because some of the other rules do relate to whether you're challenging, the person giving the press briefing, do relate to your, behavior on whether you're being harsh or whatever else. And if there are rules that could remove you from the premise and take away your press pass if you violate them, any kind of daily observance, it's like the secret police check, does have at least that mental pressure where journalists might be incentivized to self-censor or incentivized to write favorable content. I think that this is a very bad approach personally based on that. Let's go further though. This one is the not so bad part, in my opinion. It says reporters must also show they have full-time employment with an organization whose principal business is news dissemination, have a physical address in the Washington, D.C. area, and demonstrate they have access to the White House campus at least once during the prior 6 months for work, or have proof of employment within the last 3 months to cover the White House. In other words, they're making sure that the person actually works as a journalist. And also that the person resides in Washington. The one about residing in Washington, I do have some issues with that because, for example, I don't reside in Washington. And if I, for example, wanted to go cover a White House press briefing, it would be inaccessible. What this essentially does is limits the ability of independent journalists or journalists with smaller networks from actually attending the White House press briefings. Basically, this limits, unless they're in Washington, it means that only the major networks, the ones that can afford to have a Washington bureau or a journalist stationed in Washington specifically to cover the White House, it means that they're the only ones who are going to have that kind of access. Now, of course, Epoch Times, we do have a White House reporter. I should be clear. We are actually present there. But personally, I think that White House press briefings should be slightly more accessible. At the very least, you should be able to get a day pass. I don't know if they allow that or not. I think you should be able to have some degree of access. I don't know. I think they used to have the ability to get in on shorter term. I don't know if they're eliminating that, but I think there's some problems here and some not, in my opinion. It says, additionally, this is the real problematic part, in my opinion, though. I'm going to explain. Additionally, reporters may be kicked out of White House press briefings if they make too many interruptions or argue too much with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, as many reporters have done in the past. Now, you have had issues recently. Now, this is the problem with the White House press briefings, and this actually ties to a bigger issue with the way they're done overall. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but the White House does not actually manage, technically, the reporters who are present there or how the whole thing works. That's managed instead by a weird conglomeration of the major news networks and of a local journalist association. Now, in other words, you have like New York Times and Washington Post and all these other establishment media basically regulating how the whole thing works. They're the ones who get to choose who gets preferential seating. They're the ones who get to choose who, of course, front row and whatever else. And they give themselves privileges, which is why you typically only see establishment media getting to ask questions. The only way, for the most part, that non-establishment media can get to ask questions because of the way it's being managed, not by the White House, but by this external organization, is if they shout their questions, if they yell things out. And that is part of kind of the normal process. Now, that being said, you do have agitators. And this was true even when Trump was president. Do you remember like Jim Acosta, and a lot of Trump supporters wanted him kicked out of the White House? He was the CNN guy who was always like heckling and yelling things out and causing trouble. And even when Trump was meeting with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, like Jim Acosta was making some really unsavory comments that people were saying could like risk war with North Korea. There were real concerns with that. When you get journalists whose behavior is extreme, even in very sensitive situations. For example, again, you have like a major diplomatic meeting. There's peace talks. There's talks about nuclear disarmament. And you have journalists acting like nutcases, or asking questions that are meant to incite or inflame the relationships that are in a very delicate state. In that case, I can see some of the argument for it. You also have some people who are spies. You might remember Trump actually kicked out a lot of the Chinese media, for example, because a lot of them had direct ties to the Chinese government. I could have told them that, 15 years ago, heck, had they listened to me in 2008 or something like that, like I could have told them those media were spy organizations being run as proxies of the Chinese Communist Party. Like I could have saved them a lot of work. But finally they did kick them out, and I think that was a good move as well. In other words, not all journalists are journalists. You have lobbyists, you have people working for special interest groups, you have people who are there because they're on invite because of some, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of relationship. You have people who are there working as essentially media agitators with the sole purpose of, essentially inciting things and causing a scene and getting web clicks because that's just what they do. There are things like that. The question is, do those, well, first of all, there should be a review on like spies and lobbyists and that kind of thing. But when you get to the issue, for example, of, let's say, how do you decide if a person is a real journalist or not? How do you decide if the White House is just kicking someone out because they dislike the media or they dislike the questions? And how do you deal with the fact that the establishment media basically run the show? And the only way for independent journalists to even ask questions is to shout them out. Those are some of the real questions that should be addressed. Personally, I think that the way the Press Association works in Washington, and especially where you essentially have an establishment, all the media running the show, deciding who gets to sit where, deciding who gets preferential treatment, et cetera, who gets to go on the press trips, who gets to ride on Air Force One. It's all the establishment media making those calls. I think the White House should run that, not these media organizations, which will obviously give themselves preferential treatment and obviously give that same type of preferential treatment to people who align with their ideas. I think that system is broken and that system needs to be fixed. The other issue I have, though, is you also have the issue of whether the government is regulating who qualifies as a journalist or not. And even when it comes to free speech laws, even when it comes to protections on journalists and so on, this is an issue that, for example, I know James O'Keefe has raised quite a bit. Project Veritas now does James O'Keefe Media Group, OMG, right? O'Keefe Media Group. James O'Keefe has raised the point several times, and I fully agree with him, that the government appears to be trying to determine what qualifies as a journalist and what does not. And what they're suggesting is that if you're not with an establishment media, if you're not big enough, you don't qualify as a journalist. Who defines what a journalist is? Is your YouTuber a journalist? Is your your blogger or someone who runs a one of these other Medium or something like that type websites, do they qualify as journalists? Would a social media influencer like on Twitter or TikTok qualify as a journalist? Where do we draw the line and how do we determine this? Well, it's a complicated issue. I think that if your primary business is in the credible telling of news, you should be qualified as a journalist. Well, even then, how do you qualify what is credible or not? I'd say most of the establishment media is not credible at this point. Some people say InfoWars should be the platform because they deem it not credible. He's a bit extravagant, but he gets a lot of things right as well. In other words, who determines what is true and what is false? And so it does get into some murky, complicated waters when you try to regulate what a journalist is and what a journalist is not. And then, of course, you have organizations like Antifa, like Black Lives Matter, and so on, which basically, get their agitators and put cameras in their hands and call them journalists and try to grant them special protections and treatment, especially when dealing with police, while they're beating and attacking and harassing people. And then, of course, if someone steps in or does anything, or the media hone in on them, and then they expose them and try to destroy their reputations. And that footage is fed to all the mainstream news outlets, which then do the same. If a police officer arrests them or, arrests those journalists in particular, then it's framed by all the media. Police attack journalists. This is where you get into the nuances of these types of protections and why you do start running into them. Now, that being said, my personal opinion, law enforcement should be able to do its job within the boundaries of the Constitution, regardless of whether someone calls themselves a journalist or not. There are protections on free speech. There are legal protections on the ability to expose things. There are whistleblower protections. Those things should not be stifled by it, nor would they based on the Constitution. If you have Antifa or BLM putting cameras in people's hands and calling them journalists and thinking they can't be arrested, they should still be able to be arrested if they commit crimes, plain and simple. The White House should not be determining who a journalist is and who a journalist is not, but there should be some kind of review to make sure they're not spies or working for foreign governments, working like, state media or whatever like that. But again, it does get complicated because you deal with some countries where all the media is state media, and do you allow them to cover the White House press briefing? There should be individual reviews and things like that. And also, the establishment, in my opinion, should not be able to run the meetings. They should not be able to determine who gets in and who does not, because it becomes a deep special interest. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, public-private partnership, which is the real mess being caused right now. My personal take on all that. That said, let's talk about something I can't talk to you about on YouTube. So let's jump over to Epoch TV, because there's this new protective order on Trump, and this is actually more significant on a deeper level than it first meets the eye. A lot of people might say, hey, special protection order on Trump, that's huge. It's actually more significant than even what it appears on the surface, because it relates to whether Trump can actually expose his side of the story on the 2020 elections publicly. I'll explain to you on Epoch TV, because YouTube will probably give me a strike if I talk about it. Join us on Epoch TV, link in the description. We have a flash sale right now, so check that out. You can get a subscription very cheap, and then you can join our Q&A and also see the rest of this episode. Come over to Epoch TV, epochtv.com, link in the description. I'll see you there.